Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank Matt for the kind introduction. It's great to be amongst some wonderful leaders in both national security and biosecurity, and to have a great conversation on a panel today. What I thought I'd do is take off of what Matt was talking about. He talked a bit about cybersecurity. We know AI is in the news. During 9/11, I had nuclear codes around my neck, and I was in the National Military Command Center where we rehearse all the time a potential nuclear attack. And we've got these screens that we monitor, and we know if North Korea is lighting up a missile, China, we can see that all the time. In cyber, we're now at a pretty good place where we can see cyber attacks happening to us, and we're able to react. We're not there in biosecurity, but it's an interesting comparison when you look at those three, and I wonder if our panel, starting with you, Richard, could give your thoughts on lessons learned, comparisons of those. What do you think?
Sure, no thanks, Tom. I do think the other domains where we have to develop comprehensive security solutions are really important to look at, and that we can draw lessons from him. I think, it's incredibly encouraging to hear coming from the private sector, Matt, for example, describing his concept of systems and global pervasive surveillance. Areas like nuclear security, cyber security, I would even say other areas that you might not think of, like earthquake security or fire security. These are problems that, for the most part, we have figured out how to distribute cost across society. These are not areas where we are exclusively reliant on public sector funding to address the security problem. But the security problems that we're trying to address are each structured in unique ways, and the sets of solutions that we can find are based on how they're structured. Cybersecurity, right? We're all carrying around a phone. We're all at immediate risk, and we're all willing to undertake some of the cost of paying for cyber protections. Nuclear security, the example that you mentioned, is very remote for most people. That's about controlling material and chains of custody. But there are analogies from security problem to security problem, and my concern looking at bio is that because it does stretch across health and national security and other domains and is novel, most people haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. We haven't really figured out how to conceptualize the problem in a way that helps us come up with sustainable ways of regulating or distributing costs across the economy, which is what we're going to need to do if we're going to address these problems in the way they need to be addressed.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I wonder if our other two panelists would like to offer anything in this area.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Richard. Those are great points. Look, I love the question. I think it's important to look at technologies that have come before and as we apply them to biotechnology. When I was at the National Security Council, it was helpful to make references back to other technologies that the policy community may be more familiar with, right? Like cyber, like AI, like semiconductors. And so I think it's important to look for lessons learned, but also lessons tried, right? What was tried and then didn't work, so that we can start from a different perspective. Richard talked a lot about some great analogies. Maybe I'll bring in the importance of kind of collective norms generation and building. This was really formative in the early days of the cybersecurity community. It was, community-driven codes of conduct, right? And we're seeing this in real time in the AI community. Discussions along the advances in generative AI. The community is pondering in real time, where should appropriate restrictions be? What should the role be of industry, of governments, right? And how do governments think about regulating a technology alongside very rapid innovation in that area? So I think a lesson that we can take to biotech is, since we haven't yet potentially reached that leap ahead moment, or we're still in the formative stage of a lot of these technologies, is can we start these conversations now, right? Can we start to think about what that intersection is between the public and the private sector? Some of those points that Richard touched on, and do so in an international context, right? Biology doesn't respect borders, right? It is self-sustaining. So we need to have these discussions now. We need to have them with private sector, with public sector, with international colleagues, and build in multilateral systems, not just of norms and of governance, but really moving into biosecurity systems like we heard Matt talk about earlier. And in doing so, we can build in reinforcements, mutual reinforcements, takes the barrier or the burden off of one individual country, one individual industry, and we need to do this with a large, diverse group of people that share, our values.
Now, those are excellent points. Thank you, and thanks for raising the public and the private coming together to work this challenge together. In many cases, you're seeing the private sector lead in biosecurity, and the more that we can do in a public-private fashion would be great. But we'll come back to that. Megan.
Thanks. Actually, I would like to build off of Michelle's point too on AI and bringing together the international community. I've seen throughout the course of the day how prominent AI has been in these conversations. And so it's interesting right now to take a look at what's happening in AI and draw the parallels where we need to for biosecurity. And what we're witnessing with ChatGPT is this full-scale scramble that's been generated by a signature public breakthrough. And it's disrupting or promising to disrupt business models. It's moving governments all over the world and citizens alike. It's capturing the imagination of everyone. And I would posit that we haven't had the ChatGPT moment for biotechnology yet. We here in the room, we see it. We see the potential. We know it's coming. And so why does this matter for biosecurity? We are at this inflection point where we don't have the hype machine forcing us to take action. So we actually have this time right now where we can think, we can resource, we can plan, we can act methodically to build our bio-future. So at the State Department, we're thinking about this, as Michelle pointed out, the need to move internationally, so I can just build off of that. We are asking with our foreign partners, and that includes industry, we're asking with our foreign partners, governments, academia, industry leaders, what does the global architecture look like for managing biotech risk, but also promoting the vast potential of biotechnology? What value systems are we aligning with? This values conversation is very important and one that we really need to come together around to understand what our values are. What guardrails are we putting in place to manage biorisk and strengthen biosafety and biosecurity all over the world? And we really need to work together in that anticipation of that moment that hasn't yet arrived and ensure we unlock the power of biology while at the same time inspiring creativity, equity, and managing risk. But you asked about biosecurity specifically, so I just wanted to also take a moment to talk about, from the State Department's perspective, what we need to do around biosecurity. COVID-19 obviously really heightened our awareness of biological risk. I think that comes as no surprise. The Bioeconomy Executive Order, our National Biodefense Strategy, these really drive home the need to incentivize and strengthen biosecurity, both at home and around the world, as more and more researchers experiment with biology. So from our perspective in terms of biosecurity, we will absolutely draw parallels where necessary with AI, with cybersecurity, with nuclear security. We're seeing a lot of good examples out there, but we are also looking at this bigger framework. We need to strengthen the political will all over the world. We need governments to come in and say this is a priority. 2, we need to build capacity. So the capacity building point is very important that we all are a part of. And 3, we need to strengthen the connective tissue amongst all of these players, governments, academia, non-government, the practitioner community, industry. We need to strengthen that connective tissue and share these best practices. So I think we're going to be learning a lot from AI, but we're also going to be learning a lot with AI as we look at this interface between biology and artificial intelligence.
Well, that was excellent. And I want to pick up on one of the points you made about we haven't had our Chat GPT moment. And it's really amazing how that has really accelerated where we're at, where the country is on AI today. But we have had our COVID moment. And you would think that that would be enough to drive the world towards a more secure biosecurity framework. And I wonder why it has not. I've spent many years in Washington. I was the chief of engineers, and we dealt with crises all the time. In a lot of these natural disasters, we knew the impact of what would happen. We didn't invest ahead of time, and then we invested a lot more much later after the crisis occurred. And then we went on to the next priority. So the question I'd like to pose is, we're post the COVID pandemic. It seems logical that we would create a biosecurity framework. And the question is, who should lead that? How do we keep the priority in the country a priority, in fact, in the world? And I thought maybe, Michelle, you could help lead this.
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off with the caveat, right? As you mentioned, it's a challenging question, right? They don't call it the panic and neglect cycle for nothing. We've been here before. I hope we're not here again, but we had similar conversations, after H1N1, after Ebola. So your point of how do we sustain this momentum, it's critical right now. And unfortunately, we might already be in that neglect stage of this cycle, right? So I think in terms of who should lead on the US side, I don't know that there's necessarily one right leader, but what I think we need are champions, right? We need champions spanning Congress, the executive branch, private sector, international partners, right? And we need to make collectively the argument to do two things. The first is to sustain the advancements that we've made over the last 3 years, right? We invested a lot of money at the onset of the pandemic. It would be not only a shame, but it would damage our economic security, our national security, to let those advances, fall away, right, and have to start over again and reinvest, those money the next time around. So, anything from vaccine manufacturing and capacity, clinical trial infrastructure, diagnostics and telemedicine at the edge, biosurveillance, right? We made real leap ahead advances in this capacity. Of course, more needs to be done, but I think collectively we can make the argument for what is the type of investment that could be made to sustain what we already have in progress, right? Whether it's keeping capacity warm, maybe it's not functioning at the maximum pandemic speed, or, and maybe, better yet, can we integrate this into our health system, right? And can we look for investments that strengthen our ability to just deliver better health care? In doing so, make ourselves a more resilient population for the next pandemic. And any of those examples of buckets of technology I mentioned, by continuing to invest and strengthen those tech areas and those facets of pandemic response, it will make us, better be able to deliver healthcare, to the United States and to the globe.
Great. And Megan, do you think those investments will come through so that we can sustain the momentum that we've got?
Yeah, sorry. The investments, other than monetary investments, we've made so much investment over the course of this administration in our policies that really set that strong framework to keep going, that sustaining portion. We've had the Bioeconomy Executive Order, the National Biodefense Strategy and its implementation plan, the 100 Days Mission that maybe Richard would come in on. And hopefully through these policies and frameworks, we are keeping warm. We are doing exactly that, is preventing that neglect. You've asked about leadership and who would lead in this effort. And I know a lot of you might be thinking domestically who would lead. Is it the White House? Is it the agencies? And everybody has a role to play. There's probably not one leader amongst all these. But what we think about at the State Department is US leadership as a whole globally, and how do we project that? What is the role of diplomacy, and what is the work of the US government alongside our private sector? So many of you represented here today, our academia, our non-government institutions and organizations, and our leadership along with our allies and partners internationally. It's absolutely critical right now that the US, our allies, our companies, our innovators remain world leaders in this vital technology to our economic and national security. We believe in the role of the private sector in setting the standards, consensus-based standards, the norms, being able to harness the power of biotechnology for good and solve global challenges together. And as my Secretary Blinken said, our task is to put forth and carry out a compelling vision for how to use tech in a way that serves our people, protects our interests, and upholds our values. And so this is absolutely vital in terms of leadership globally. It is not necessarily one entity. It is not just the US government. It's incumbent upon all of us to project those things internationally. So as another part of not neglecting the future and not falling into complacency as we emerge from COVID, we have also put together an international engagement plan as part of the executive order to drive forward the positives of this technology, the promote of this paradigm, while also mitigating the risks that we know are emerging or exist, and doing that alongside our allies and partners.
I think it's really important, the point you're raising, that it's going to take global leadership and everyone's got to be involved. I think if we go back to the parallel with cyber, and you think that when there was a cyber issue in my organizations, it was the IT person's job. Until we really got serious about it, we put funding, we put structure, we created a cyber command, and now it's everybody's job, and everybody's ingrained in it. And I wonder, Richard, you've been involved in the government, in the structure, concerned about these biosecurity issues, and as you wrestled with the structure as it was and envision what the structure might be in the future, do you see a structural component to how we should move forward?
I do. One group that I think should not be in charge of our biosecurity is the Department of Health and Human Services. This is not just a health problem. Matt made this point in his opening remarks. This is a problem that is pervasive. It needs to be across the public and private sectors, but it certainly needs, within government, it certainly needs to be whole of government. And I think, just as a thought experiment, imagine that infectious diseases didn't have names, and we just had this class of threat infectious disease, and they would come and go, and every winter we would have epidemics, and periodically we'd have gigantic sort of world-shattering pandemics, but they didn't have names and they didn't have particularity, and the countermeasures were not very specific for each specific threat. Everybody would recognize the importance of infectious disease as a category of threat, and we would figure out how to build safer buildings and have better ventilation systems and have building codes and distribute that risk in the way that I was talking about. I think we are globally moving towards that kind of understanding that this is not just a health problem. And I do think, just want to reiterate the point about the importance of engaging internationally. This is not a problem that the United States, whether the public sector in the US or the private sector in the US, can solve for itself and by itself and be safe. It has to be a global solution because of the nature of the threat. I would charge the people in this room as, being at the leading edge of the bioeconomy, your responsibilities in helping the government and governments develop solutions are something that you should take very seriously. Biosecurity should not be just a topic at the end of the day. It should be a frame through which we think about everything that we're doing.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. One of the things that I wanted to follow up on is this international component. And you travel the world, Megan, you're seeing these other countries, and I wonder if you're seeing anyone that's got a comprehensive biosecurity strategy, or they're moving forward with a program that's really starting to stick.
Yes. We are seeing a lot of good progress around the world in thinking about this issue, thinking about biosecurity more holistically. And I think our executive order had a lot to do with that in showing that biosecurity is not an afterthought. It's part and parcel of the bioeconomy and growing a prosperous bioeconomy. You cannot promote the positives of the technology and not think about the security, and not just from a health lens, but from a cross-sectoral lens. So we've seen a lot of good progress. I'll probably disappoint you by not naming, calling out any countries here, but I would say we've seen a massive uptick in the number of national strategies and plans and consortia really trying to wrap their minds around how to grow a bioeconomy. And it's in synthetic biology, it's in workforce development, growing local talent, it's in biomanufacturing infrastructure and capabilities. And it's not just developed countries, it's also emerging economies. And this is a really important voice to include in our discussions going forward. They have seen how the United States, upon decades of investment in biotechnology R&D, they have seen how quickly we could respond to the COVID pandemic, and they've realized the value proposition that biotechnology is for their economies and their national security. And they want to get in on the ground floor of harnessing this technology, being part of the discussion around values that I mentioned earlier, being part of the discussion around shaping a meaningful biosecurity framework and what it means to have equity and innovation. So we've seen it across the board. It's a really exciting time, but at the same time, we should be mindful of the fact that biosecurity policy, regulation, practice is patchwork around the world. And that is something that we really do need to address if we want to have a sustainable, safe, and secure bioeconomy. So going back to the three things I mentioned in terms of how we are going to address this in the political will, the capacity building, and the connective tissue, I just can't come back to those enough as really, really important parts of channeling that energy that there is all over the world for growing a bioeconomy, but also making sure that we are doing it in that safe and secure way.
Okay, we're about ready to wrap up here. I wanted to do some closing comments, but due to time, I'm going to ask just that one of us do the closing comments, and maybe one of the panelists would like to close and talk about maybe the public-private partnership idea. Do you think that, Michelle?
Yeah, let me just close in like the last 5 seconds. One of the things that I think when Megan and I were chatting earlier and harkening back to the executive order, the importance of what we're talking about here in biosecurity and making sure that that disseminates down into the next generation of talent. We know that we need to train more and more people to be a part of this future bioeconomy. There's tons of potential here, and we need an influx of more talent in order to be able to serve all of the cool products and capabilities that folks in this room are working on. And so, part of Richard's point of not having it be the afterthought at the end of the day is, as we think about how we train the future workforce, making sure that these discussions of biosecurity are part of those conversations from the onset.
Excellent. Thank you for wrapping it up for us.
Of course.
Thank you.